So let's go ahead and get started, since we do have a little bit of a longer lecture today. And I want to get y'all out of here at a reasonable time since it is Friday before Thanksgiving. I'm not sure if this is your last class or not from today, but regardless, I hope y'all have a safe and happy travels next week. Please be careful, don't get hurt, that kind of fun stuff. Keep an eye on the whole COVID thing. It's been pretty low lately, so I'm not too concerned about it, but do what you can to kind of protect yourself and protect your family. As always, don't forget quiz 13 is due on Sunday, even though we do have, Thanksgiving coming up. So make sure you get it done early now so you don't have to think about it. And again, there's only one more after this, and it'll cover the next week or so of lecture, which won't be until after we get back from Thanksgiving. So you have a full week off next week, and then we'll have one more week of classes, and then it's all downhill from there. So with that being said, don't forget about the final exam. It takes place on the 10th at 10 a.m. Again, it's just going to be 40 questions, so you'll really only need about 20 to 30 minutes, but if we absolutely have to, we can stay for the full 2.5 hours. Please don't make me do that. But it's not a big deal if you need that time. I'm always happy to make sure that y'all have whatever you need to be successful.
Is the exam in this room?
Yes, so the exam will be in this room. Don't forget about the extra credit. It is due December 3rd, which I know is like a week early, but that will give me time to actually process it and be able to get that document out to you guys so you can actually see what all of y'all's products look like and kind of clean things up a little bit too. Also, don't forget with Connecting with Biology 3 is due on December 1st. That is kind of coming up rather quickly here, so just make sure you're keeping an eye on those things. And as always, if you have any questions about any of the assignments, exams, what have you, do not be afraid to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer questions. So I'd rather have you have questions now than questions after you turn it in and you lose points. Yeah. All right. So with that being said, does anybody have any questions or anything before we get started today? Cool. All right. So all of Wednesday, we kind of set the basis for what is conservation, why is it important, and kind of the history of it, right? Kind of putting everything into context. Well, today we're going to be looking at the actual threats themselves, as well as kind of some of the things that we do to mitigate them, and kind of include some cool case example stuff that I've been involved with and some really out there stuff like rewilding, which is really fascinating, but kind of sketchy too at the same time, but it's kind of cool. Now, obviously a lot of different human activities do destroy habitats. And so this is kind of your classic example of some of the threats humans cause. Habitat destruction is probably the primary threat to biodiversity, with a lot of this area often being used for agriculture or development for cities, all that kind of fun stuff. Humans ultimately have altered more than 50% of the land, replacing prairies, wetlands, and forests with farms, rangeland, and cities. Here, just in the Southeast alone, we've lost over 100 million acres of longleaf pine savanna, and that's now down to about 1 million acres. So there's some out there. A million acres sounds like a lot, but when you put it in the context that we've lost over 99 million of that, it's a pretty big deal, right? That's 99% decline in that habitat. Humans specifically have often actively destroyed forests because timber has a pretty important value, right? So deforestation is simply the removal of all trees from the forested area, which drastically alters not just the number of trees in the canopy, which affects like habitat types and all that stuff, but can alter things like the levels of CO2 and oxygen in the atmosphere. Because where does that oxygen that we breathe come from, right? It's from the photosynthesis from those plants. And wood from these trees also store carbon. So they're sucking up all that CO2 and turning it into giant tall trees. That's the CO2 that's not going to be floating around in the atmosphere. So it is important to make sure when we're cutting these things that we do have that kind of carbon focus imprint in mind. And specifically when we go through and do like slash and burn techniques to kind of get down and put all those nutrients back into the soil, what that does, all that burning is going to release all that excess carbon that was stored in those trees and other plants back into the atmosphere. Ultimately, all world biomes are under threat. However, it's typically more of the tropical rainforests that are getting hit much harder just due to the economic circumstances of a lot of those places. Ultimately, all of Earth's ecosystems have been affected. whether it be the grasses in the forests that are pretty easy to see that they're shrinking worldwide, as well as things like freshwater habitats, which have become a lot more polluted, as well as, I don't know how much of y'all realize this, but there's long going 30-year legal battles in the courts around who has the water rights for the Flint River, which touches Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. These states have been fighting over who gets the right to draw water from it, put it into their agricultural fields, or give cities water from it, or who can dump their remnants of their sewage into it. All that kind of stuff plays a factor here. And kind of coming through that, pollution in particular is that degradation of that habitat. So yeah, you might still have habitat there, but we're kind of causing it not to be as good quality. And that too can have a dramatic impact on how many organisms can kind of occupy those roles. So pollution is any sort of chemical, physical, or biological change in the environment that harms living organisms. Notice that it's not just a chemical thing. It can be things like sediment getting rushed or washed away after big storms that clog rivers and cause you not to be able to see through that water. That's really important for an animal that uses its eyes to try to find its prey, right? That kind of stuff can cause massive impact. And ultimately degrades the quality of air, water, and land, threatening our biodiversity worldwide. And while here in the US, we have some pretty stringent laws on what we can and can't do, that is not the case everywhere. Particularly in developing countries like India and China, they have pretty lax laws when it comes to these environmental regulations. And as a result, they've had a lot more pollution than what we have. Now, water pollution in particular threatens a lot of aquatic life, unsurprisingly. Things like chemicals, toxins, plastic, raw sewage, fertilizers, animal waste are all examples of some of these pollutants that threaten our water life today. With heavily polluted water, are more likely to contain all of those different contaminants at the same time. Here, just in the US, you can see classic examples of how water pollution causes those mass eutrophication events, where you have large explosions in plant growth, which sounds like a good thing in theory, but all that does is just choke out all these waterways and ultimately lead to a lack of oxygen in the water, killing off fish, invertebrates, all that kind of good stuff. This water pollution is also subject to biomagnification, like we talked about, where very small amounts of things are going to be building up and building up and building up in this tissue of those higher trophic organisms. But of course, it's not just water pollution, right? There's air pollution too, which is kind of a little bit harder and not as easy to well define, right? Because it's harder to just kind of look at the air and be like, oh yeah, this looks like shit. Unless it's really bad. And if it's gotten to that point, you're in trouble. But if you just sit there and realize, oh, well, the smoke from fire, the coal ash that gets thrown up in there after, coal-fired power plants, all that stuff can go up into the atmosphere and may not necessarily be immediately noticeable, but it can cause major health declines, both in humans and in the environment overall. Additionally, some of these pollutants can be redeposited as things like acid rain, where it causes the rain that precipitates out of some of these clouds to be a lot more acidic. And as a result, keep in mind, this is a very, very minor change in acidity, going from, a pH of 7 to pH like 5 at most. That little change in pH can cause massive degradation in overall plant community health and all that kind of fun stuff. And then you get things like pollution depleting Earth's ozone layer. Some of the CFCs and a lot of that stuff that we've outlawed out of air conditioning has caused massive degradation in the ozone layer, which ultimately kind of protects us from a lot of excess UV rays that would have gotten in that or without that layer. And finally, the big thing that kind of all shapes a lot of this air pollution, water pollution, is global climate change in general, which is being affected by all these different things, which is where you have greenhouse gases, typically things like methane or carbon dioxide, that are released as air pollutants, which we don't necessarily think of as all the time. And what that does is it kind of creates this greenhouse effect, where basically those gases sit up in the atmosphere and it reflects a lot of the energy from the sun that comes in back into the earth. And as a result, it's slowly warming the earth. Now, mind you, this has happened naturally as well, where you get things like volcanoes and stuff like that that have emitted a ton of these greenhouse gases in prior, hundreds of millions of years ago. But a lot of what we're seeing now is definitely human cost. And here's a great example of how you can actually see this. So starting about the 1800s, where you have a lot of rapid industrialization, particularly in places like the US and Europe, you see this massive increase in the amount of CO2 per concentration in the atmosphere in parts per million. And as a result, you can see this kind of J-shaped curve. Granted, there's a lot of noise to this, but the temperature decreases right along with it. And ultimately, this kind of thing can have severe climate or consequences. Obviously, it's pretty easy to be like, oh, well, we're going to lose the ice caps. But even if we don't have them completely melt, there's a lot of other problems that this can happen. And global climate change, and the reason why we're calling it change and not warming, is because a lot of these impacts are often very individualized and almost random, depending on the location, how the mountains around it, how the deserts around it, all that stuff interact. And it causes really dramatic changes in climate. They just may not be, explicitly warming a specific area. In fact, here in the Southeast, it's often predicted that we're going to get a lot more rain. Our temperatures are going to remain relatively the same, but we're going to have a lot more extreme weather events, things like hurricanes, because basically that Gulf Stream has been supercharged with a little extra heat, and as a result, it's causing those hurricanes to spin a little bit faster. Now, this one kind of is a lot more direct to human cause, and I do like to point this one out as well, and we'll have an entire lecture on it. Invasive species are a huge problem as well, where they're basically organisms that humans have introduced into new habitats, and as a result, they're displacing native species. And when they do that, they completely destroy often that very delicate balance like we've talked about, causing those crazy trophic cascades. Now, a non-native species not only changes the composition of a community, but it may also carry things like diseases with it that may spread to the native species that are already there. Things like, the Cuban tree frog, which is, invasive from the Caribbean islands. And those were brought into Florida. Those have turned out to be a great host for things like coronavirus. And so just by having them in that environment, it dramatically increases the overall amounts of coronavirus across all of the hosts, not just Cuban tree frogs. Ultimately, there are over 498 different types of invasive plants, animals, and microorganisms in the US, and this number is ever climbing, with many more invasive species occurring worldwide. Things like raccoons, squirrels, things that we just kind of associate as just normal part of life here in the US are invasive in places like Japan and Europe, and as a result have caused major economic catastrophes. And when you're talking about human-specific effects on wildlife in particular, I don't think you can't not mention overexploitation. So this isn't all just hunting, mind you. There's a lot of other things that can happen that just kind of result in bycatch. Probably one of the greatest examples of this is the vaquita, which is a small little dolphin species about 4 feet long that occurs in the Gulf of Mexico, or not the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of California. And as a result, they're very similarly in size to this very unique fish species that's often kind of targeted by typically fishermen from outside of the North American continent. I think it's usually Southeast Asia, plus a little bit of India, plus a little bit of Africa as well. And so they send boats in, they harvest as many of these fish as they can, and because they're out in technically international waters, they don't have to use a lot of the anti-dolphin catching technology. And as a result, they catch the dolphins with them, they kill everything off. They're now down to like 30 individuals. To the point that they're so desperate that they're contemplating trying to bring these animals into captivity and just build up a population. But to be honest with you, that program will probably fail just because of the political nature of bringing dolphins into captivity. Nobody wants that, at least right now. And as a result, if something bad were to happen during one of those capture events, when the whole point is to bring these animals into captivity, reproduce them, get them back into the wild. If something bad goes wrong or happens, that whole program gets shut down, that entire species goes extinct. Now, some of this biodiversity may be recoverable. There's a lot of really cool examples of this and some of the things that I've gotten to be personally involved with that we'll talk about. For instance, here's a great example. The bald eagle was once incredibly endangered, mainly due to a chemical called DDT, which was used to kill off mosquitoes. But because of bioaccumulation, DDT would build up in the flesh and ultimately the shell tissue for bald eagles, which would cause these really weakened shells that as a result would crack really easily and kill the offspring before they have a chance to actually become little tiny baby eagles. Kind of unfortunate. Now, once they banned the use of most DDT, and there still are some applications where it can be used, ultimately you see massive increases in those populations. So where nowadays you go out to where that weird Vietnam War memorial is over here in Mims and Bithell area, and there's a ton of them out there. You would have never seen that 30 years ago. And ultimately, it becomes important to understand how to protect and restore these habitats so that way not just one species benefits, but all of them do. Because obviously, maybe you want to target things like keystone species, where if you protect them, it protects a bunch of things kind of as a big umbrella. And kind of the classic phrase of, a rising tide, brings up all ships kind of thing. Now, various conservation efforts could be used to save individual species, whether it be things like ecotourism, which provides economic incentives to protect that species, or biotechnology that can bring back extinct species by cloning them. And ultimately, conserving biodiversity involves a lot of scientists, of course, but involves a lot of ordinary citizens too. For instance, there's entire programs up in the Northeast where they're working with the Blandings turtle, where they basically send all these little tiny juvenile turtles to go live at some elementary schools where they're then raised up by the kids as basically class pets. And those animals are then released a year later. So that way, basically the scientists don't have to raise them themselves, but they can still have just massive numbers of turtles to then put back out on the landscape. So I do want to kind of focus on some cool conservation implications. This is probably my favorite species. This is the dusky gopher frog. It is down to 200 individuals in the wild, and it's isolated to like 3 little wetlands in Southwest Mississippi. Now, before we get into that, I kind of want to talk about some of the options that we had when it came to the plant. Things like translocation, which is the act of moving an animal from one area to another for the purpose of conserving an organism, right? So say, for instance, if the habitat just goes to shit, but you still have some area that's nearby that maybe they weren't already in, you can move some of those animals into that space. Head starting, which is where you actually take some of those animals, let them breed naturally or just collect eggs or what have you, raise those up in captivity, and then use that to kind of start that translocation process. And finally, something even more interesting, rewilding, which is where you translocate an animal into a habitat that hasn't previously occupied, and a newly translocated species is associated with attempting to fill niches of species that have gone extinct. Things like putting in elephants where mammoths were, or rhinos here in North America where there once were previously rhinos, that kind of thing. And kind of the big question kind of comes up here is that what do you find as natural? Do you define how Earth looked 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or even just before human colonization or European colonization? Because all of that kind of matters if you're defining how to get things back to nature, back to being more natural. So here's a really cool example of some of the translocations I've been involved with a little bit of head starting as well. But we brought in these tadpoles, we reared them up in big cattle tanks, and then released them out of the landscape where you can see these little tiny juvenile gopher frogs here. Really cute little things. They're about that big. Now, there's a lot of benefits from these kinds of programs where you're filling a niche that's been lost with the species that's been previously occupying that site. And ultimately, this should avoid issues associated with things like invasion biology, right? You're not moving it to a new place, you're keeping it where it used to be. This is often a way to restore an extirpated species from a site. And that happens all the time, where just an animal can't get back to where it previously was on its own. However, we've seen a variety of success with this kind of thing. We have tortoises like desert and gopher tortoises here in Florida, as well as things like garter snakes out in San Francisco, as well as our little gopher frogs. But these successes seem to be related to the amount of planning prior to release. So the amount of effort going into management and monitoring over a long period of time to make sure you're not just dumping animals off that just get decimated, they're actually staying around and hanging on. But there's a lot of drawbacks to this. Obviously, it's incredibly expensive to hire people to basically be frog farmers. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service spent about $2 million a year just to fund this Go for Frog program. We did things on that cheap. And ultimately, this requires a lot of knowledge of the natural history. You're not going to just be able to go in there and be like, yeah, I know everything. You have to sit there, learn, and monitor the environment to see how these things change, how your actions are actually working. Ultimately, this method is useless if there's no available transportation site, because either they've been destroyed by environmental factors or just the lack of addressing primary concerns. So here's a really cool example of this. Apologies for where the pictures are coming in. So here with Rana simosa, or the dusky gopher frog, which was listed as an endangered subpopulation of the gopher frog that we have here in Florida in 2001. But due to some genetic evidence, we realized it's actually a separate species. There are currently, again, about 150 to 200 adults left, with the majority using a single location in the DeSoto National Forest near Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Very, very small chance. And the thing is, remember how we talked about how when you have everything in one little small area, all it takes is one little event to wipe out everything. Now, there's been a major translocation and head starting effort that's been in place since the 1990s. This involved releasing both tadpoles and metamorphosed frogs onto these sites and then monitoring that population with something called the drift fence. And ultimately, we know that there's a disease element here that's taking a toll on these animals. Now, the initial translocation seemed extremely successful, but as we began kind of increasing more and more tadpoles into these locations, we begin to see decreased recruitment. Now, ultimately, what we figured out is that this pathogen, Dermomycoides, also known as Perkinsia, in the DeSoto National Forest was very present. That was causing these large outbreaks in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And ultimately, there was a lot of work that was done to just kind of establish, oh, this is a disease that we're dealing with, and this is what it's doing. And what we very quickly realized is even though we didn't necessarily detect it all the time, this pathogen was basically wiping out all of the efforts that we were doing here. So here, for instance, you have survival of metamorphosis. So did these animals go from being a tadpole to a little tiny frog in percentage? And these animals were living in these little mesh cages. So in other words, they couldn't be attacked by predators. They were getting fed every day. Like these animals should be doing amazingly. But they were still sitting in the same water with all the other native species. And what we saw very quickly is just massive mortality, where in some locations, literally none of them made it to survive. And ultimately what we realized was, as we opened up these dead animals that we collected, is that it's all, that same disease. And so that's kind of the reason why I started studying Perkinsia in the first place. It was wiping out this really cute little frog that was basically on its last legs anyways. And we quickly realized that it's literally everywhere. And it's starting to affect species that are over here in Florida, species in North Carolina, species in South Carolina, Georgia, what have you. Now, the thing I kind of want to point out here is that it was incredibly important to constantly continuing monitor that species post-release, right? Because otherwise we would have had no idea that that species wasn't thriving. We had just been like, oh yeah, we put 1,000 tadpoles in there, but we should be seeing gopher frogs. Great. If you're not monitoring and following up, you're going to totally miss the dynamics of what's happening afterwards. So ultimately, you need some sort of framework to kind of say translocations can be successful, but you really need to kind of put them into the right context, as well as kind of establish very clearly how to go forward with them. Now let's kind of dig into rewilding a little bit, just because I think it's a really neat topic and it's something that it's kind of weird, but it's still really fascinating. Now, rewilding is kind of a Pandora's box. There's a huge lack of consensus on what truly defines the term rewilding. And it's challenging to predict the outcome of introducing new species into a habitat, even though we think they might act how the other species may have, we don't have that guarantee. Ultimately, there's a kind of a suggestion that maybe we should be protecting our own biodiversity that's still present there, instead of worrying about trying to enhance ecosystem functions or protecting African species in North America. Doesn't always make sense. Ultimately, there's a huge need for things like cost-benefit analysis and using a more precautionary approach before we start dumping rhinos out in the middle of Montana. But probably the classic example of this is the Pleistocene rewilding that's been proposed for North America, where a lot of these species, including camels, elephants, giraffes, rhinos, all of this stuff used to be very similar to the stuff that we saw in North America 10,000 years ago. So, and there's still plants out there like the Osage orange, that the seed is so huge, there's no way possibly it can be eaten by any of our current herbivores, because it was probably eaten by things like mastodons and mammoths. So by putting, elephants out there, maybe we can reintroduce this plant and have it be doing better. But again, there's a lot of questionableness with this. Ultimately, this is kind of a three-stage idea where they're going to find these plausible proxies for extinct species. I think a couple of them that they specifically mentioned were things like cheetahs, lions, and elephants being released onto private property and monitoring them. And then ultimately creating these ecological history parks. And obviously there's a lot of drawbacks to this. Proxies are not genetically identified, possible disease transmission, habitats aren't static, and there's, of course, just a lot of unexpected outcomes when you introduce new species into the place. But it doesn't always have to be bad. Kind of coming back to this, there's another great example of things like wolves, right? Wolves in Yellowstone, wolves in northern Mexico. We went and put these animals back on the landscape, and the landscape recovered and is doing amazing. But keep in mind, a lot of these animals only disappeared in the last, 500 years or so. So it's all about timescales and saying, what do you define as a natural system and how do you get back to that point? So here specifically, we have an introduction of wolves in Mexico, where teams use different methods to pick alternative areas for the best suitable habitat for determining where reintroduction should take place. And ultimately, they realized that there was a lot of associations with wolf habitat types, both historical range and buffer areas from human populations. And they found that the largest patches with the highest quality for reintroduction through a lot of the spatial modeling. And ultimately, these results showed that wolf occurrence was not associated with habitat type. These results led to two options, basically the small habitat area with low mortality rates or high habitat areas with high mortality rates, and kind of a lot of that picking and choosing of how to best go about these things. Now, with a lot of these reintroductions, one of the things I do want to point out is that the rates of success are incredibly variable. You have things like native game species like deer, turkey, what have you. Their populations declined, but we caught them early enough that they had good genetics and a lot of the habitat was still okay. So of course they did really well. And about 81% of them did. A lot of threatened, endangered, or sensitive species. Overall, you have about a 51% chance of these kinds of reintroductions and things working out. But then you start kind of digging into how they go about things and you realize that there's a lot of kind of variability, whether you're looking at good release habitat, the location of release in general, looking at whether it's the core, the stark range, or it's on the periphery. In other words, is it where this animal is perfectly designed to live, or is it always kind of the shitty habitat that it never really wanted to be in, it just kind of got stuck there? Whether or not the animals are captive reared or not, as well as what kind of food habit they get. It's a lot more persuasive to release something like a bison or a deer onto the landscape than it is for a wolf. Because ultimately, especially people that are in there doing rangeland or any of that sort of like farming, you're going to have a hard time convincing them that you should let wolves or bears back onto the landscape, where as if you were just talking about deer or bison, that would be a little bit easier. Okay. So kind of a little side shot that I want to take you. So we talked about Head Start and we talked about translocations. And part of that is managing captive populations, right? Those animals have to come from somewhere. And so I think it's really important, especially because this context for why I added this to the lecture this year is that last year I had a student that was very anti-zoo. There's nothing wrong with that. However, when we were talking about some of these conservation things, and I would kind of like say haphazardly, hey, yeah, zoos raise up a ton of things and have very specific programs for how they handle animals and all this kind of good stuff. She had no idea. And so it was kind of a nice excuse to kind of talk about, yeah, not all zoos are great. Some of them are out there and shitty like Tiger King. But then you look at places here in Central Florida and look at Disney's Animal Kingdom, which, mind you, there's a really cool story that I'm going to tell real fast. Back in like 2018, Hollywood Studios was which is a park right next to Animal Kingdom, it was getting a new fireworks show. And so as a result, they built this massive, brand new perimeter fireworks system that cost them like millions and millions of dollars. However, about a month into using this, they noticed that there was some very odd behavior coming from the African elephant herd. Now, mind you, the African elephant herd at Animal Kingdom was probably the best managed elephant herd anywhere in the country, if not the globe, outside of like being in natural habitats. Like this is probably the best breeding and reproducing population. They're perfectly managed. Like they have amazing social structures and everything. This is really hard to pull off a shit ton of land to do. And they have that out in the safari. Well, when those animals started showing those adverse behaviors, what they would do is they sent a team of behavior researchers for animals to go and watch these animals for, I don't know, a couple of weeks over the, where they would do full 24-hour watches and just kind of keep an eye on them, seeing what's triggering these behaviors and what specifically could be done about it. Well, it turns out using some infrasound audio recording equipment, they realized that the booms from the fireworks, even though we're still 2-3 miles away, were setting off these behaviors. And so this brand new, couple $1 million facility was shut down immediately, and they went back to the old way of doing things just to keep the elephants happy. Yeah, just for context, like this is the kind of stuff even shitty companies like Disney are still willing to do to protect their animals. Now, when you're talking about wildlife, there's a bunch of different organizations that kind of recognize what's important, what species we need to focus on. Now, globally, you have the IUCN, which is the International Union on Conservation of Natural Resources, which recognize the value of captive breeding programs. And they kind of keep an eye on the EAZA, which is the European Zoo Association, and the American Zoo Association, the AZA. And kind of inform them, hey, these species are ones we think you should be looking at and trying to manage as long-term captive populations. And so this is what you get to this concept of ex situ conservation. In other words, managing populations outside of the wild to be able to potentially release them back into the wild at some point, or just to have them as ambassador animals. So that's just important too. You're not going to give a shit about, rhinos, elephants, if you're just looking at pictures. You need to go see them. You need to actually see how cool those animals are. Just like, for instance, when you guys did the that Connecting with Biology 2 ascent, you had a different understanding of what the Arboretum looked like, all the different kinds of plants that were out there, the different kinds of animals that were out there. And you need that kind of effect when it comes to some of these more far-flung kind of animals that are kind of on the edge of our periphery, if you will. Now, ultimately, they assist conservation by establishing populations in secure sites that can't be removed or damaged. When you've got a lot of issues with poaching, it's probably good to have some of those animals protected, because you can't necessarily do that in South Africa, Rwanda, that sort of place. There's just not the effort, there's just not the money, there's just not the ability to do it. Educating and engaging public on conservation issues, which is a huge part of this whole mission. Providing the focus for fundraising efforts for conservation. The Bronx Zoo alone has raised millions and millions of dollars just going into gorilla conservation, just from a single exhibit where they have a little donation box right at the front. As well as providing animals for research on the basis of biology for the species and knowledge that can be then applied to conservation of species in the wild. That's really important. Things like the killer whales at SeaWorld, which, I'm not a huge fan of them being there, but because they have them there, they can do things like learn how to fly drones over them to do visual identification, learn how to get breath from them. When they come up and take a breath and push out all that water vapor, they'll collect that and try to figure out how they can do things like eDNA and a bunch of other analyses so you can look at how well that animal's doing. And what's really cool is ultimately they've used all of that information to then send those drones out and send those technology back out to the Pacific Northwest or the Atlantic coast off of like Iceland and Norway, and looking at the health of those populations. And now we have a better understanding than we ever would have, because we understand kind of it gives us a control, if you will. If we know that the animals at SeaWorld are eating well and have good body condition, and we go out and we see skinny, kind of unhealthy looking animals out on the coast of the Pacific Northwest because they're just not getting enough food, we then realize, oh, well, we need to augment these animals and give them more food some way, shape, or form. So all that stuff can be really useful. And ultimately providing animals for reintroduction programs. Disney alone has released 15 white rhinos since they've opened in 1998 back into South Africa, which, mind you, they're only producing a couple every year, right? That's a little over half of the animals that they kept at one point since they've been open have all been released back into South Africa to game preserves. It's really cool. But, and here just to give you some just flat out numbers here, here's the number of total worldwide zoos and aquariums, roughly 1,300, with a little over 1.5 million or so individual animals being housed in these locations. Of these, 5 to 10% of the available spaces are used for endangered species, because people want to see some very charismatic things that aren't necessarily endangered all the time. Now, during the last 20 years, the role of zoos has expanded dramatically, with active participation in these wide-ranging collaborative captive breeding and conservation activities. So let's talk about some of these roles for offsite conservation breeding. They have 3 primary roles, and that's to simply provide demographic and genetic support for wildlife populations, establish sources of founding for new populations in the wild, prevent extinction of species that have no immediate chance of survival in the wild, as well as, and often if you look at these long-term goals of captive breeding programs, it's to reintroduce species back into the wild, not just to hold them for forever. So as a result, you kind of have to think a little bit differently about how you're taking care of animals. You don't want a bunch of just genetically inbred shitty lines. You need actual animals that are taken well care of so that they can actually have a chance of being released. Additionally, you want to make sure you don't accidentally, for lack of a better word, domesticize animals. Because ultimately, one of the things that can happen is there's no intentional design of this. You may end up artificially selecting for animals that just do better in captivity. So you have to be kind of aware of that and make sure you're not accidentally only breeding animals that do well. And that kind of brings back in that genetic component that I mentioned earlier. So remember, it's not just about a species level biodiversity or individual level stuff. You have to look at the overall genetics of something. You can't just say, oh, the species is still here. If it's got 3 animals, 1 male and 2 females, your genetics are going to be shit and the animals are going to die off in 10 years anyways. So all these captive individuals need to use a lot of genetic and demographic data to actually inform which one should be breeding with where, which have created these really cool long-term captive breeding programs like the species survival plan that ACA uses, where basically zoos have no control over what animals they breed or when they breed them. Basically, ACA decides, okay, you're getting this Komodo dragon, this Komodo dragon's moving from over here, and they may decide, oh, no, we're not breeding these animals anymore. In fact, white tigers, right, which many of y'all probably grew up seeing in zoos, have been completely phased out by AZA because there's not enough space for the Malayan tiger, the Sumatran tiger, and the Siberian tiger that they'd much rather breed. So there's some really interesting dynamics with this. And ultimately, you've got the introduction of these new populations should have enough genetic variation so that they can become adapted to their new environment by natural selection. You need that basis of evolution, right? And finally, for populations retained in captivity, it's necessary to breed those traits that will enable long-term survival in captivity without causing them to just be designed for captivity. It's a very complicated gray area sort of deal where you're just trying to find the right way to balance all these different pressures together. Ultimately, conservation breeding should be used sparingly. It's obviously extremely difficult to pull off. It took us, I don't know, over 100 years to figure out how to breed things like bushmasters and some of the really endangered species of snakes from South America, just because we didn't have a good understanding of their biology, but that didn't help things either. And plus, it's expensive. A tiger on its own could eat about $10,000. It takes about $10,000 a year to feed a Bengal tiger every year. That adds up quickly if you're not financially solvent enough to do it. And animals ultimately need to be chosen and selected for captive breeding programs, so that way they're actually good representations of those animals in the wild. And this may involve doing some really outlandish things, like taking sperm that's been cryobanked for 40 years and using that to, breed an animal with, instead of using a male that's alive right now, which could be a lot cheaper. And again, those 3 criteria need to be considered for selecting candidates that are the best individuals for those species for captive breeding. Of course, there's economic considerations, biological suitability for captive breeding, as well as the likelihood of successful reintroduction. And like I mentioned here, you've got this tiger example here, where just recently this has happened, right? So up until probably the mid 2010s, everything was just kind of a Bengal tiger, which was often just kind of a mix of a bunch of different subspecies together. There weren't true necessarily Bengal tigers here in the US. But during that time, they realized there were three subspecies, I should say, that were being selected for by AZA to better boost those populations in captivity and potentially actually establish well-defined, reproducible, scientifically based breeding programs that can then be used to potentially augment populations in the future. And as a result, they picked the Malayan tiger and the Sumatran tiger for more southern-based zoos, places like Miami, Central Florida, Animal Kingdom, Busch Gardens, what have you. Whereas the Siberian tiger, which is much more cold tolerant, pretty much ended up in all the northern zoos. And they actually removed Bengal tigers from those more northern zoos completely and just kind of stopped breeding them altogether. And ultimately, it becomes really important to consider source populations to make sure you're selecting for maximizing the best genetics and the best available ecological ability to adapt. However, obviously, this isn't perfect. Problems are going to happen. And one of the big questions that you then have to deal with is, so for instance, how do you partition available species to all these different subspecies of tigers, right? As we've kind of been alluding to. It kind of comes back to these considerations for choosing who to use for conservation breeding using three conservation goals: maximizing the number of surviving subspecies, maximizing the genetic variation at that species level, or maximizing the genetic diversity at the subspecies level. All three of these things have to be kind of considered. And so ultimately we choose only one subspecies and have it well represented at a zoo, or should we choose all subspecies and have really poor representations with bad genetics? Kind of a catch-22 there. Now, ultimately, you kind of have these like 6 stages rather of captive breeding. We have a decline in the wild population and its genetic consequences. They found a captive population where they go out and collect, say, 20 or 30 individuals or whoever's left. Things like California condors were down to like the tens when they finally found all of them. Expanding that captive population to a secure size, so going out and breeding them and trying to get those population numbers up. Finally, managing that captive population over generations to make sure you've got adequate genetic variability, all that kind of fun stuff. Making sure you're not just constantly breeding sibling to sibling. Choosing individuals for reintroduction from those populations that best represent not only the best available genetics, but as well as making sure they're representative of where they need to be. And finally, actually managing those reintroduced populations in the wild. And it kind of creates this process of foundation, growth, and maintenance. When you're talking about the actual captive population, which the foundation is where you're actually creating that population. The growth is that initial rapid breeding once you establish that breeding program. And finally, that maintenance is actually going through and selecting for which individuals need to be continuing on their genetics and other ones that don't. For instance, a great example of this is PJ, the Great Indian one-horned rhino that's currently at Central Florida Zoo. The reason why he's there and not actively part of breeding programs is because his genetics are way too overrepresented in the population of Indian rhinos here in the US. And so since they're an animal that does pretty well on its own, they just isolated him, kept him at a smaller zoo, and that way they don't have to worry about trying to make his genetics fit into the overall plan. And you can actually see a visual look at this whole process where you've got that collapsing in the wild population, that initial founding event, the growth in that captive population, ultimately the maintenance, and where you've got these reintroduction points here, which are going to steadily increase the actual wildlife population. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that the number of animals per number of zoos dramatically decreased. Because again, we're refocusing on how we do a lot of these breeding events. We're focusing on new species, and we're trying to make sure that it's not just thrown together, so it's not an actual accurate way of doing things. Ultimately, as we get to that management phase, as that population approaches its target size, the focus increasingly shifts to being more intense genetic management and making sure that those animals are what we want them to be and that they can survive and thrive on the landscape. So here's kind of just a brief overall view of some of the conservation implications, as well as kind of the threats that are out there. Don't feel like you need to know everything that was in these reintroduction slides or the translocation slides or anything, but do know the big picture items, like what is translocation or what is rewilding, and maybe be able to answer kind of what might not necessarily be a good reason why you would want to do one of these things. Money is probably a good example for all of them. So just something to keep in mind. Does anybody have any questions or anything on all these topics? And feel free to, like, if you don't agree with something I've said today, feel free to call me out and we can talk about it. It's an open discussion. Cool, so everybody believes in conservation, that we should, use zoos and everything that we have at our disposal. Great, I like that. All right. Well, I hope y'all have an amazing Thanksgiving. Please take the time to rest and relax a little bit. Don't use it to study the entire time or work on assignments. It'll be much better for you. That little bit of a break can make a massive difference in how well you're going to do things. All right. And don't forget, if you have questions, ask. I'm always here to help.